What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some upcoming CRPGs and basically everything going on with them in the year 2025. As we kick this year off, I wanted to basically compile everything about my favorite genre all in one place, so while I have talked about a few of these things before, there is some new information here. Though before we dive in fully, probably worth a mention that while I certainly expect some stuff to come up in 2025 in terms of announcements and things, I think for instance we'll very likely hear from Cat Games given the number of projects they're working on and how long it's been since their last full game release and their general release cadence up to that point. But beyond something like that, and any other surprises, I tried to gather everything I possibly could into this one place. But the land of video games is a pretty unpredictable place, so I guess we will wind up seeing what happens. Jumping fully into this video, kicking it off, we're going to talk a bit about Pathfinder and the Dragon's Demand. So I've talked about this one previously, but at the time it was not confirmed for sure that it was happening because it was a Kickstarter project. Well, since I've spoken about it last, that project has been fully funded, even reached a couple of stretch goals, and thus Pathfinder the Dragon's Demand will in fact be happening. I believe it's slated for late 2026, if everything goes well and there aren't any delays, that kind of stuff. This one is doing a few interesting things, namely it is using miniatures as its sort of presentation style, and while the game is like a full CRPG, we'll have animations, etc. They are kind of centering around what it would actually be like to, say, play the game with those miniatures, which I think will be especially interesting outside of actual combat scenarios, so I think it'll take seeing that fully in motion to really get to grips with it for me. But it's an interesting idea that I haven't seen too much of, and thus I'm open to seeing how it pans out. Also, the Dragon's Demand adventure centers largely around the small hamlet of a town called Belhaim and the re-emergence of a long-dead or vanquished dragon, as you might imagine. But it is notable that they are planning on expanding that module quite a bit, so exactly what happens in that module might not necessarily be the best point of reference, but nonetheless, that one looks very cool, even if it is a fair ways off. Now, the second title I want to talk about is actually a game I forgot to talk about in my upcoming games for 2025, and that is a CRPG called The Way of Wrath. Now, I initially checked this game out some time ago via a demo that is, I believe, a bit out of date, frankly, but The Way of Wrath is supposed to be releasing in 2025, and it will ultimately center around a sort of scenario. Basically, you have about 10 days until a confrontation with an enemy trying to attack your lands and tribe. Your job here, basically, is simply to prepare for that attack, and it looks like they're trying to do a lot of stuff. In particular, it looks like there's going to be some tribe politics mechanics where you have to basically set laws for your tribe, and the outcomes of that might not necessarily be what you think. The choices and things you make will give you your own reputation against your people, which will affect how they see you and what they'll do for you, all while trying to set up defenses and put yourself in as strong a place as possible and weaken the enemy before they get there. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to see play out, which is why I'm looking forward to this one, so hoping it pans out pretty well. But that does bring us to another interesting little indie title known as the Necromancer's Tale. So this is another game that I've checked out with a demo that I believe is a bit on the older side, as this one is planned for July 2025, but the Necromancer's Tale, as the name might imply, basically takes you through the role of a necromancer coming into their knowledge and power. You find yourself coming back home after a few unfortunate events and your father's untimely demise, but along the way you happen to stumble across a dark arcane book filled with terrible knowledge that might just help you get what you need, and this follows your character into a sort of descent into madness as they fully embrace being a necromancer, and just the demo that I played was quite good. Now, this kind of game isn't for everybody inherently. I believe it's going to be a bit of a slow burn, and it's certainly not going to have a higher end production value by any stretch, but again, what I've played of it, I've enjoyed. It's even got turn-based combat with all your minions and stuff, and a fully fleshed out town environment for you to explore as you're trying to do all these things and potentially make all these rituals happen. And it strikes me as the kind of game that might very well wind up being a sort of hidden gem, which is in large part why I am looking forward to it. Now, the rest of these games on this list I've talked about a bit more frequently, but nonetheless, to get them out there and make sure they're in everybody's minds, we first up have Solasta 2, recently announced at the Game Awards. Solasta 2 will be launching into early access later this year, and it looks to be a very large improvement on the original game pretty much across the board. Most recently, since I've spoken about it last, they've actually put out an update showing off some of their new in-game character models, as Solasta 2 will be in a different engine than the original, which allowed them to completely overhaul how their character models looked, which is probably for the best because as much as I enjoyed Solasta for what it wasn't the best looking game in the world. But realistically, that's just a superficial improvement upon other more substantial improvements, like a sort of overworld map that is actually explorable where you can find optional things as opposed to the more linear main campaign of the original game, and a whole host of other details they've talked about. So ultimately, I think if they can make all these improvements and changes while still retaining the core of what made Solasta unique in the field of CRPGs, then I think they will likely successfully have carved out their niche, that is to say Tactical Adventures, the game's developer, even within this space. So for that reason, I think if you enjoy CRPGs at all, Solasta 2 is definitely one to keep an eye on. There is a huge amount of potential there. Next up, however, we then have Avernum 4. This is releasing in 2025, but it is a remaster or a remake of the original game, which is much older than that. And while it is the fourth entry in the Avernum series, it's probably worth a mention that the first three games were sort of their own trilogy, and then 4 through 6 were also sort of their own trilogy, so if you just jump straight into 4, it won't be the end of the world or anything. But the Avernum series is, I would say, one of the biggest series from Spiderweb Software, a maker of many a retro CRPG, both at the time they were actually being made, that is to say the 1990s and early 2000s, and they've pretty much continued to do that for the last 30 or so years. And Avernum itself has seen a few remakes over the years. It originally released in its first version all the way back in, I think, 1995, and it's about a group of outcasts getting thrown into a sort of subterranean kingdom that the surface just throws all their exiles into, though the fourth entry in particular takes place quite some time after that original trilogy. But it's a series I haven't played personally, and I'm going to try to get through the original trilogy before the fourth one drops, but it seems like it'll probably be a great way to check out that series, which is something I've been putting off for quite some time, and I'm excited to finally get around to it. Following on from that, however, we have Banquet For Fools, I would say probably one of the most visually striking CRPGs I've seen in quite some time. Banquet For Fools takes place in the world of Serpent and the Staglands that the game's developers had made previously, but the game itself follows the 4 adventurers on a quest to solve a mystery around an abandoned village, though obviously things are a bit more complicated than that, and while you are investigating and looking into all of those things, you'll ultimately be engaging with a whole host of systems like spellcrafting, choice and consequence, and many different ways to build your character. It has a demo available right now. It's also released into early access not all that long ago, I believe back in October, I think, of last year. I'm not sure. But either way, very cool game, probably worth checking out, just in general, but in particular, definitely looking forward to reviewing this one in full, which is a somewhat similar situation for Swordhaven, a Baldur's Gate 1 inspired title from the makers of Avernum RPG, which itself was in fact a Fallout inspired RPG. So Swordhaven, Iron Conspiracy to give it its full name, seems to be taking quite a bit from what Baldur's Gate 1 was, and it also relatively recently launched into early access, though just back in December, and we find ourselves in the land of Nova Draconia, tracking down a conspiracy around a special bit of iron and a whole lot of other nasty goings-on. So having played a bit of this one as well, it definitely feels like the older games that it is inspired by, which is always a good start, but what's more, even just right away, they start getting you involved in all sorts of choice and consequence, different ways to handle things, like for instance, one of the first towns you go to has a sort of barbarian problem, and you'll be able to get to the bottom of why they are there and what they want and what you, if anything, decide to do about it. And that's to say nothing of like the character origins and stuff, so all of that on top of a robust character system, and you've got a game that definitely has my attention at the very least. And while I expect, frankly, a bit of jank just like Avernum RPG had, it does also seem like Avernum Team here learned quite a few lessons from their previous releases, and thus it's definitely one to keep your eye on if you enjoy CRPGs more generally. Getting towards the end here, we then have New Arc Line, yet another CRPG that released into early access not all that long ago. New Arc Line is obviously inspired by the likes of Arcanum, mixing steampunk and magic obscura in a world that largely pits those two things against each other. Now, having played through the early access of this one, this game is extremely promising. It's a little bare bones in early access right now in terms of like what's available character creation wise, and there are plenty of things that still need to be hammered out, but the core of what is here is really good. I mentioned a numerous amount of very bizarre and interesting quests and things you could get up to as you arrive to this new land. I think the combat and spell systems are especially interesting, and while those issues I just mentioned are definitely present, I still think this game has a ton of potential, and it will mostly just come down to how successful its trip through early access winds up being. Now, it's been a little slow through the holidays, but I imagine we'll start getting more updates to that one soon, and I'll almost certainly be covering those in some capacity. So there is that. Now, another game that is unlikely to release in 2025 is then Shadow of the Road. Shadow of the Road is one of the games being published by Owlcat Games that puts sort of steampunk in a Japanese setting, where we'll be fighting off, of course, actual machinery and then things like yokai spirits. So it certainly looks and sounds like an interesting title, and they've shown off a little bit of gameplay here and there, but realistically we don't know too much about Shadow of the Road yet, and while I don't expect it to release in 2025, I do almost certainly expect some news about it, on top of, again, probably finding out whatever else Owlcat has actually been working on themselves, or at least one of their several projects they're apparently working on. So there is that. Now, towards the end of the list here, just a few odds and ends I wanted to call out. For starters, may or may not be a CRPG pile, I guess, begins and ends with Greedfall 2. So Greedfall 2, obviously a sequel to Greedfall, takes a lot of, I would say, the almost BioWare-esque formula that Spiders, its developer, had been iterating upon prior to this game, but then kind of hinges upon that more tactical combat system that something like Dragon Age Origins had. And it looks like, if anything, they're trying to make this game substantially similar to Dragon Age Origins, and ultimately that game was considered a CRPG, and with good reason, obviously. And so while I haven't really seen it labeled as such, I'm actually thinking Greedfall 2 might wind up being a game I consider to be a CRPG, but honestly the jury's still out on that one, and certainly some room for interpretation, and that's to say nothing of its relatively rocky start to its early access. But starting in 2025 we should start seeing some substantial updates to that, including like new areas and new maps and stuff, which I will also likely cover throughout the year, as it's a game I'm quite interested in. Though given I think they have no small amount of work to do, given again the reaction to its launch in early access, I'm not so sure we'll see that one in 2025 as a full release. And then last but not least, just a couple odds and ends. Baldur's Gate 3 is getting patch 8 sometime here in the early part of the year, which is going to bring 12 new subclasses, which is going to be more or less a DLC-sized update then, which is especially noteworthy considering they said they weren't actually doing DLC for that game, but nonetheless very excited to play through that. And then lastly, we are also getting a DLC for Rogue Trader. It's at least final announced one, which is Lex Imperialis. No idea if we'll get more than that, but this DLC will center around the Imperium's Imperial tithe that it collects from all of its worlds, including all the worlds you, as a Rogue Trader, own. And given just how good their first DLC wound up being, Void of Shadows, I'm really excited to see what they can do with this one. But with that, I think we've covered just about everything there is to know CRPG-wise, both in 2025 and a little bit beyond, so hopefully all of that will wind up coming to pass or being interesting, and with any luck on top of that, we will also get some news about some more fantastic upcoming CRPGs. But for right now, that's pretty much going to do it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.